Welcome to the Science of Beers podcast with me, Mick McGee. I love having proper conversations with intelligent people, especially over a beer, and that's exactly what this podcast is. We'll cover a new topic each week, so join us with a beer and let's cheers to science. So what do you think about that introduction? Do you like the rock music? Is it a bit too much? Is it alright? Does it work? This is the first episode of Science and Beers, the Science and Beers podcast. So I'm really looking for feedback. If you can get back to me, what do you like? And especially what you don't like. Because we can adapt this and turn it into something that works well for the majority. If you're aware of the Science and Beers brand, you might have been to one of our live talks. We were running them a very long time ago. Probably about a year since the last one, I think. But we did 3 seasons of talks. The rooms, each talk, it was jam-packed. And obviously, we can't do that in the current pandemic. Pack a room full of people. But the pandemic also brought the idea for this podcast. Bring it online and do it once a week. That means we can talk science over a beer once a week for as long as people want to listen to it. And you can tune in anytime you like, however you like. You don't need to put on trousers anymore like you used to for the old talks. You can enjoy it like me right now at home in your underwear, the cold can of beer. Choice is yours. So we can develop this into something that works well. So please give me your feedback. The idea being that we take science talk to the bar, sitting down with an academic, having a pint of beer, maybe 5, maybe 6, and just discussing science in detail. But the bars are closed now as well. So this first episode, it's done with a virtual beer over Skype. But also because we're doing it over Skype, that means we're not limited with the geography of our guests. So this conversation is with Dr. Daniel Mills, who is on the phone with me from Portland, Oregon. He specializes in Earth history and how life developed, particularly between 0.5 and 2.5 billion years ago. Dr. Daniel Mills, he's a friend of mine. He has a PhD from the University of Southern Denmark, and he's currently a postdoc at Stanford University in California. Really hope you enjoyed this conversation, and really please leave feedback. Either send us an email at scienceandbeers@gmail.com or on Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook at Science and Beers. Hope you enjoy. Danny boy, how you doing?
Good. Look at you with that microphone. Looks good.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
I feel like I'm already on a show.
A show where a guy talks to a sock. Talks into a sock. Dan, thanks very much for joining me from Portland, Oregon. It's a bit too early in the day for you to start beer there, unfortunately. So you're on the tee. Well, let me just crack open the beer here. There you go. Cheers, Dan.
Cheers, Michael. Thanks for having me.
Pleasure. So I know you, Dan, from the University of Southern Denmark. But I mostly know you from the bars around the university. I actually stalked you a little bit before we had this conversation. So I found your website, danielbrodymills.com, to refresh my memory from what you might have told me, in the bars of SDU. But your research, it focuses from the Cambrian explosion, which was 500 million years ago, to 2.5 billion years ago. So can we just put that into context, that time frame for our listeners, please? How does that fit in with the history of Earth?
Sure. So this time interval that you define from 2.5 billion years ago to a little more than 500 million years ago. This is labeled the Proterozoic eon. So there are three major eons in the geologic timescale. The first official being the Archean, from 4 billion years ago to 2.5. Then you have the Proterozoic, and then you have the Phanerozoic, which is what we're currently in. So the Proterozoic is often labeled informally Earth's middle age. So it's kind of in the middle of Earth's history. And it essentially starts with the irreversible oxygenation of the planet's atmosphere, what's called the Great Oxidation Event. This is really the major defining moment at the end of the Archean, beginning of the Proterozoic. So the beginning of the Proterozoic is marked by, you now have oxygen in the atmosphere. And then the Proterozoic essentially ends with the appearance of not only animal life in the rock record, the beginnings of animal life, but also beginnings of a more modern biosphere with eukaryotic primary producers, algae versus cyanobacteria, and the beginnings of a more modern world. So those kind of define the beginning and the end of the Proterozoic.
So you sent me a book called The Biosphere a couple of days ago, by Vernadsky, and I'm a few pages in, and it's truly fascinating that this guy was one of the first to see how biology and chemistry and geology, they're so interconnected, and you can't have a proper picture of Earth history without looking at them all together. Do you want to talk a bit about Vernadsky?
Vernadsky, but Vernadsky is not like a household name. He's pretty obscure even amongst biogeochemists, like in the West.
Which is really unfortunate, given your talk about the noosphere and the book. Of course, the book's from 1926, but how many other genre-defining books came and papers came from that era?
No, a lot.
Like in physics, there was a golden age for physics, and then I wasn't aware of this guy Vernadsky.
No,
until you introduced me to him.
No, and it's unfortunate because so Vernadsky was. So he was born in Russia, but his parents they're ethnically Ukrainian. And he was a Russian mineralogist and geochemist who died towards the end of World War II. So, he's a Ukrainian, Russian, Soviet mineralogist and geochemist, or I should say geologist. And then he really pioneered and developed the field of what's now called biogeochemistry, which is a huge field in the West. And, so intellectually, I think he has some kind of ownership over launching the field, though that may not be explicitly recognized by a lot of practicing biogeochemists in the West. But essentially, he's most famous, at least in the West, for the book you mentioned that was first published in Russian in 1926 and actually wasn't translated to English until the late 80s. and then
Wow.
again in the 90s. And that's the biosphere. And I mean, the biosphere is a household term. Everyone, people use that word a lot, but it means very different things to different people.
Whenever I learned biosphere, the definition that I learned was everything that's living on
Yeah,
Earth.
no, that's a good point. That's a common. So it's confusing because it's defined in different ways in different contexts, right? It could be the sum total of everything that's alive on the planet, right? It could also just be the realm of the Earth that it is inhabited. So wherever organisms live and persist, that's the biosphere, right? Or so those are usually today I think those are probably the two most common. So either be like the sum total of life on the planet or the sum total of all ecosystems on the planet, then embracing organisms and their environments. So, but it gets really confusing because a lot of people define geobiology as like the coevolution of the biosphere and Earth's surface environment. And that's really funny because in a lot of ways, Earth's surface environment is the biosphere. So it's the coevolution of the biosphere with the biosphere. It's actually, it's a common phrasing that I think a lot of people take for granted, but it's actually really important to dissect it and break it down and understand where this concept came from. And Vernadsky didn't invent it. It's usually attributed to Edward Suess, who was a geologist, a Swiss geologist, writing in the late 19th century. And as far as I know, he used the word but didn't really define it. And then Vernadsky really ran with it and really developed it in a substantial way for the first time. And
it's really interesting that he's a mineralogist,
right? So he's not a biologist, yeah.
Which is because I studied biology, and whenever you're studying biology, you study biology,
yeah.
And I would imagine if you study chemistry, you study chemistry. If you study mineralogy, you study mineralogy. But it takes you to step back quite a long way to see that everything is linked. If you study this, it's related to that. And I guess for a mineralogist, he's trying to figure out, okay, where did all these things came from? And the answer came up more times than not. It must have came from life that must have existed millions, if not a billion years ago.
Right.
And that must have been well, it is an absolutely breathtaking thing to think of,
No, absolutely. Like his interests he was a sort of a polymath, and he spoke like maybe a dozen languages and read in a dozen languages.
Wow.
And was interested in a number of things. Even so, I mean, there have been a lot of polymaths in history and so on, and he's certainly one of them. But I mean, maybe not like, he wasn't like a painter as well, but yeah, right. This is before, now we take for granted that we have like images of the Earth from space and these sorts of things. Like he didn't have any of that. Like it is amazing that he had such a holistic view of the planet at the time that he was active. And essentially, like as a mineralogist and a geologist, his interest in life was in recognizing life and appreciating life as a geologic force. That's probably the best way to sum up, the most succinct way to sum up the biosphere. What's the take-home message? Is that life itself is a geologic force on the planet. And he actually called life. He had his own vocabulary that we don't really use in the West. He would never refer to life as life. He would refer to life as living matter. And he did this very deliberately because he was an atheist and he didn't want any connotations of vitalism. The idea that there's there's something extra about life that can't be captured by its physical chemical description. There's something other, transcendent, divine about life. He wasn't. I don't think he was actually trying to reject. He just didn't want to go there. So he called it living matter, to kind of separate living processes from any kind of discussion or mention of vitalism. But he mostly looked at life in terms of their the metabolic activity of organisms and their cycling of major bioessential elements in the planet, and the novel forms of matter that life makes as a result of its living activity, from shells or certain kinds of rocks or
it's like life from the past can sustain life from today. So salts like calcium carbonate runs in from dissolved rock into the ocean. That's used to make shells for microorganisms. They die, they go down to the bottom of the ocean, they become sediment, they become a rock. Earth's movement lifts up that rock again. The rock dissolves, it goes into the water, it becomes shells. It's just, like the pyramids, they're made from, like, how old are those single-celled organisms that make the pyramids? The foraminifera. They're like millions of years old, so they fell, they became limestone, they get dug up, turned into pyramids.
I didn't even realize that. Are the pyramids made of limestone?
They're made
I
from
never
limestone,
knew that. Yeah, I never realized
Foraminifera,
that.
millions of year old microorganisms. The chalk that we scrape against our blackboard, millions of year old.
No, it's a good point. Yeah.
Microorganisms from the sea.
No, and it emphasizes exactly like what Vernadsky was trying to get at, because you might think of chalk as like that's non-living, inorganic.
It's just chalk.
But right,
it's just chalk. Who thinks about chalk? Who thinks about where does chalk come from? It's just something.
Right.
It makes that annoying sound against the blackboard.
But a lot of these things, they would not exist in the absence of life. Even these inert materials.
Even the very ground that we stand on is like the Earth's crust. A lot of it grew from like dead microorganisms that have fallen in their droves and became solidified.
Right. Yeah.
Through the heat and pressures of Earth's interior.
Well, look at like the cliffs of Dover. I mean, like that. You wouldn't get that in the absence of life. You might still get calcium carbonate and stuff, but not in that manner. Not with that composition, not with that history or means of formation.
The magnitude.
Yeah, and or even the soil. Like, I think as a kid, I just assumed like soil was just there and plants grew in it, but not realizing that life makes soil. In the absence of life, there'd just be barren regolith and rock, on our surface.
Well, this is also, processes that happened billions of years ago. Everything today would be impossible without it. For example, the Great Oxygenation Event.
Mm-hmm.
So there would be, correct me if I'm wrong, but the ozone is needed to block out UV, harmful shortwave radiation from the sun. If it comes down, it's very, very difficult for life to grow on land without that high intensity radiation damaging the cells on land. It's okay underwater because the water sends it away, but the fact that cyanobacteria 2.5 or whatever billion years ago started to produce oxygen, it made the ozone, it protected things so that it could come out of the ocean onto land, the very land that life made it.
Right.
I find that mind-blowing.
No, and that's something Vernadsky recognized, that our oxygen-rich atmosphere is a byproduct of life, and wouldn't exist in the absence of life. And it does emphasize how life irreversibly alters the planetary environment, and these changes then afford new opportunities for life's evolution. So it permits certain kinds of organisms to go on land. or maybe before they wouldn't have been able to. Um,
So what Verdansk is describing, what he described is what uh, went on to be the process that we define as biogeochemistry.
right, and I think I never actually defined the biosphere in Vernadsky's terms. So to contrast with the definitions we talked about earlier, like the sum total of life on the planet, or the sum total of Earth's ecosystems, or the Earth as one global ecosystem, that being the biosphere. Vernadsky really looked at it as more of a process, more of a happening than like a catalog of organisms or like a, and he really emphasized, he was part of this movement, this intellectual movement called Russian Cosmism. So he had a kind of cosmic perspective on Earth processes, and the cosmic connection with the biosphere is the sun. That essentially our planet is being bombarded with all this solar radiation. What the biosphere is essentially doing is that it's harnessing and processing this solar radiation, bombarding the Earth from space, and then with that energy, essentially transforming the material makeup of the planet, transforming it and transporting the material constituents of Earth's surface environment, like in biogeochemical cycling, or the formation of, certain rock types or mineral forms that wouldn't exist in the absence of life. So he looked at really as life is this mechanism. The biosphere is a mechanism for the Earth to process sunlight, essentially. And in doing that, acts as a major force of change on the planetary surface. To contrast that with some ideas, that were maybe more prevalent in the West at the time, is kind of that the Earth is just inherently the way it is. It's just conducive, given its mass, its initial composition, its distance from the sun, it lends itself to hosting life, to, presumably to creating life. Vernadsky, Vernadsky on the origin of life is an interesting topic. That's another thing. But in the West, presumably, it's all about life forming on the planet, Earth being a good place for life. And then, over time, the Earth may change on geologic timescales, and organisms kind of gradually adapting to these changes over time. Vernadsky, the emphasis is that life isn't just passively adapting itself to a changing planetary environment. It's the major geologic force on the planet. It's actually defining the surface conditions of the planet.
So that's interesting, because I've heard it many times that we're able to be where we are now because of a Goldilocks effect.
Right.
So there's no real credence given to the effect of life on the planet. It's just life should be lucky to be here. It should be lucky to be this distance from the sun. The sun, we should be lucky that the sun's that big. We should be lucky that all of these things happen. But really what you're saying and what Vernadsky's saying is that yes, we're very lucky that those things happen, but there is a large degree of life actually engineering the Earth to be even increasingly habitable to yet more life.
Right, and of course, like everything you mentioned, like all that luck still is a factor. I mean, the biosphere has no control on the mass of the Earth in general, or its initial composition, or its distance from the sun, or the nature of the sun. Life has no influence on any of those things. So of course, all that luck still plays into it. But then once you have life on the planet, which may be contingent upon all these other factors we just talked about, but once you have a biosphere, and this gets into what's called the Gaia hypothesis, which was developed in the West by a British and American scientist, much later than when Vernadsky was active. But that deals with, is life crucial to maintaining Earth's habitability? Earth must have been initially inherently habitable in order for life to establish a presence on it. But then after that point, how important is life in maintaining planetary habitability on geologic timescales, and then that brings you more into what's called the Gaia hypothesis.
Gaia hypothesis. James Lovelock. That's
right. He's essentially the founder, and the origin of the Gaia hypothesis is usually attributed to when he worked at NASA, and I don't know what years he was working at NASA, but essentially they were trying to determine whether or not there could be life on Mars, and try and develop ways of how they could test that or recognize signs for life on Mars. And he essentially just looked at its atmospheric composition and said it's dead. There's no life on the planet. The Martian atmosphere is primarily carbon dioxide, and essentially they say, in atmospheric terms, they say that the atmosphere is in equilibrium. Essentially what he emphasizes, for example, you have the persistence of atmospheric oxygen and atmospheric methane on geologic timescales. So those two gases would react and consume each other if they weren't perpetually being produced by life. So the fact that you have organisms that produce methane on Earth, methanogens, and you have organisms that produce oxygen, cyanobacteria, plants, algae, in that they're continually present on the Earth. Therefore, you could have the coexistence of methane and oxygen on geologic timescales. If in the absence of life, those gases would react with each other, consume one another, and then the planetary atmosphere would be left in equilibrium. There's no signs of anything like that on Mars. So he concluded that Mars is dead. There's no life there, or at least if there is life there, it doesn't have a planetary presence the way Earth does. And Lovelock really looked at life on Earth as being a planetary process. It's a planetary phenomenon. It's not something that happens in isolated pockets on the Earth's surface. It's a globally distributed planetary phenomenon that has major impacts on the very nature of Earth's surface environment.
So everything on the Earth, from the rocks to the atmosphere to the ocean's life, the biology, chemistry, it's all connected. And in Earth history, there's a defined in jumps in complexity. For example, before life, simple organisms, simpler, complex compared to what came before, which is like gas and
gas, yeah,
gases and stuff. But then, so there's three phases in Earth's history. There's the Archean, there's the Proterozoic, and the Phanerozoic. And the difference between each phase is defined by what I would see as like a jump in complexity. So from prokaryotes to eukaryotes, and then the eukaryotes working together to become multicellular. So I'm seeing this as complexity is just a natural phenomena in the evolution of Earth. Am I correct in thinking that? And if so, then where do we go from here?
So complexity is actually a really tricky topic, because even for biology, if you want to say something like, the complexity of life has increased over geologic time, you first have to understand what complexity is, and there's no real formal description of what complexity really means. Intuitively, we have a sense of what intuitively, I think most, you can understand why an amoeba is more complex than a bacterium, and a dog is more complex than an amoeba. But scientifically, it's really hard to describe what exactly is different between these organisms. There have been many attempts, like number of parts, or, there have been many attempts. There's no real consensus as what complexity is. And then even if you were to, have an agreed upon metric for complexity, is it increasing over geologic time? And that's that's also controversial, because, for example, Stephen Jay Gould prolific writer and paleontologist, wrote this one piece called Planet of the Bacteria, and it's that bacteria have always been the dominant, most numerous life forms on the planet, and they morphologically, I mean, modern bacteria are very different from the earliest bacteria in archaea, using bacteria very generally. But morphologically, there aren't animal-like organisms made of essentially bacterial cells. Yeah.
You're saying life got it right the first time.
Well, there's been so it's only very certain lineages that have gone through these, from only certain prokaryotic lineages contributed to the origin of eukaryotes, and then only certain eukaryotic lineages develop multicellularity, on the order of plants and animals. And then even within animals, it's only really one lineage of animals, our lineage, that has developed like a technological global civilization, and we can make things like radio telescopes and try to talk to aliens and whatnot. But that's only one lineage.
That's a lot of pressure.
Yeah,
on us.
exactly. So it's clearly not. So people, a lot of biologists really don't like talks of complexity, because first of all, we don't really know what complexity means, and then this kind of intuitive sense that a lot of people have of complexity increasing over time. A lot of biologists and paleontologists have challenged this or questioned this. Again, like most famously, just the fact that most organisms are bacteria. They've always been, they've always been the most dominant organisms on the planet. There haven't been any really major leaps in morphological complexity amongst bacteria since the origin of life itself. It's only these exceptions that we focus on, and we focus on our own lineage, right, which is self-serving, and of course is a major exception. But all that aside, like just making that disclaimer that like complexity is hard to define. The idea of
it's just the way I see it. It's as you say, it's inherently easy to see it, but to describe it and to see it as an actual system in the evolution of life is not
right.
Science has not agreed on that.
Right,
yet.
and again, like this gets caught up in all these other philosophical concepts, concepts of progress, concepts of the scala naturae, the great chain of being. This medieval concept. Maybe it goes back to ancient Greece, actually. That you have this hierarchy with God at the very top, and then maybe like inanimate rocks at the very bottom, and then you have maybe plants above rocks, and then worms, and then higher, quote unquote, higher animals, and then humans, and then angels and God. All this kind of, it brings up all that kind of stuff, but just to acknowledge it and to throw it aside as irrelevant to this conversation.
Okay.
Just to bring it up as like a disclaimer, like yes, these are things, these are controversial. We could spend hours talking about any one of those things. Everyone agrees, though, that the modern eon that we're in, the Phanerozoic literally means like the age of visible life. So the Phanerozoic is defined by the diversity of macroscopic multicellular organisms that are essentially confined to this eon. Plants, animals, fungi, so on. Before this, in the Proterozoic eon, right, most life is exclusively unicellular, and maybe there are some multicellular forms like little colonies, but even these colonies wouldn't be visible to us. They're not macroscopic yet. They may just be these filaments or chains or balls or something, and you might be able to see some signs of microbial life, like microbial mats are visible to us, but individual organisms are not visible to us. It's collections of them that are visible to us, right? And then if you go farther back to the Archean, you don't have eukaryotes, so then you essentially just have bacteria and archaea in their ancestors, and that would be so everyone agrees that there are these distinct differences in the makeup of Earth's organisms throughout these eons. And not only just the organismic content of the biosphere, but its chemical conditions, like oxygen is the big one. So everyone agrees that the Earth had these very distinct episodes, right? And that, they build on each other, moving forward in time. So that's not controversial. That's true. So the idea is, I think what you're getting at is, if this process were to continue, what would the next stage look like? What would the next eon look like?
It's a difficult question, but it's one that I'm very much interested in.
Right, and so this is inherently speculative. We can only speculate about this, but it's fun to speculate about it.
That's what beers are for, speculation.
Exactly. So it's hard. I mean, it's hard to talk. It's hard for us to talk about ourselves as humans because, there's been centuries of, historically there's been this emphasis on humans as being, the whole reason why the Earth even exists, right? Like the God essentially made, people who are theologically minded in the past view the Earth as essentially it was made so it could host humans, essentially made for us. And there's been this overemphasis on our importance and centrality on the Earth. And then really since Darwin, there's been this huge switch in the other direction, this de-emphasis on our importance and our centrality, and saying, we're just one lineage among many, many lineages on the planet. We've all evolved via the same sorts of mechanisms and processes. We're just one branch on this giant tree of life, kind of removing us from our, perceived centrality, historically speaking. So keeping that all in mind, while we project ourselves forward in Earth history, I think most people would understand that our presence on the planet is unprecedented. There's been nothing like this on the Earth before. So whether or not you think of humans as being central to creation or humans as just one lineage among many, it doesn't really matter. You don't have to, it doesn't matter if you're an atheist or a theist. It doesn't matter. The human presence on the planet as it is today is unprecedented. I think we could all agree on that, right?
Totally. So, geologists have named this new era the Anthropocene because we dig out ancient forests that have been buried for millions of years and burn it as oil, or we turn it into plastic. And today there's no part of the surface of the Earth that you can't find plastic. So in a million years, if people were to dig up the sediment from this time, they would see plastic. So we've made a defining geological impact on the Earth, and our behaviour and our consumerism changes the chemistry of the planet from the burning of fossil fuels to plastic. So how do we live in a way that is compatible with the Earth and the species that we share it with?
Yeah, so to go back, I mean, I think a lot of it moving forward isn't really about, there's a lot of emphasis on like consumer decisions, and it's on us, and it's really focusing on like minimizing our carbon footprint and these sorts of things. And I think really, like, to build off Gaia and Vernadsky, if you look at the functioning of the Earth system, you can kind of look at the life support systems, the sorts of processes, the biogeochemical processes that maintain our existence on the planet. We can kind of look at them as sort of our external planetary organs. Jim Lovelock really likes the phrase geophysiology, that there's a sort of physiology of the planet analogous to the physiology of an organism that maintains planetary homeostasis, right? And we're dependent on this homeostasis, this planetary homeostasis. So we can kind of look at the Earth system and its life support functionings again as our external organs, as an extension of our bodies in a metaphorical sense, but also in a literal sense, that we are literally dependent on these processes for our survival, the way we are literally dependent on our own internal physiological processes and our individual survival. And once we realize that the Earth really is, we're really integral to it, that, you know, we are the Earth is us, then if that perspective were to be really ingrained or part of our cultural framework, I think people of power would be less likely to exploit the Earth in a damaging, unsustainable way. The same way, maybe on an individual level, if you're abusing your body, it's unsustainable. If you abuse your body enough, it will kill you. It's the same way with the Earth. If we ravage the Earth continuously, it will kill us. And I think that's really the kind of perspective, so it's more of a shift in perspectives than, an explicit shift in consumer decisions, that I think it would be really important moving forward. And so if everyone on the planet, and speaking really idealistically and generally, if everyone on the planet really saw the Earth for what it is, people will be less likely to abuse it. For the same reason people would be, are unwilling to cut off their arms or whatever. People will be less likely to damage and destroy these external life support mechanisms.
Well, I think that we have a perfect opportunity here with a pandemic.
Yes.
Pandemic affects the entire world. And maybe we come out of it with more of a respect for science. Maybe we come out of it with more of a respect for the Earth. But it is a little bit disheartening to see all of these claims that this virus is caused by a telephone network or Bill Gates, the person that does more to combat parasites in poor countries than anybody else, arguably, in the world, has invented the virus so he can inject people with a vaccine, a mind control vaccine. It's a bit sad to see these kind of things crop up, but I don't want to leave our conversation down on that dark note that I brought us into. The difference between the phase of Earth history in which you just described is different from the three phases that came before.
Right.
Because of consciousness.
Yeah.
So all of the major creative changes that came before us were blind evolution, accidental mutations that happened to give a trait that was adapted to that particular environment at that particular time. Whereas with our consciousness, we can creatively imagine what things could be like. And we've imagined what things could be like for the betterment of ourselves. But it's only through education and understanding of the world can our creativity make something that is good for both us and for our organs.
Right.
Around the Earth.
Right.
Yeah.
No, absolutely. Because with cyanobacteria, when the first oxygen-producing organisms evolved on the planet, right, they weren't in a position to reflect on their changes.
Yeah. I wonder what would happen if I farted out an oxygen molecule.
Yeah. So that is, regardless of your worldview, I think it's something we all can agree on, is that we are in a position to reflect on the changes that we're bringing about to the rest of the Earth system. We are able to do that as a result of our consciousness. In this sense, we just mean our ability to self-reflect on our behavior, recognize its impacts on the modern world, and then our ability to project what our influence will be like moving forward in the future. Again, that's unprecedented in Earth history. So now I think part of this is we have to start imagining what a successful future will look like. What will, a lot of times it's a huge genre of of media, literature, and movies, especially of these post-apocalyptic scenarios. Like usually when we envision the future, it's in a very dystopic kind of context, in a very apocalyptic context. And there's a huge draw to those stories, of course, today. And in a sense, because it's really easy to imagine, we see the destruction that we're bringing about the Earth today. It's easy to imagine what happens when we bring it past the point of no return, and what would life on Earth be like then for our descendants? But I think it'd be more helpful to us at this stage to start imagining stories of success. What does a successful, mutually beneficial human presence on the planet look like as we project our consciousness forward? And I think we have to really start thinking more about that. What does success look like? How do we bring it about?
Or somebody living 50 years from now has just as much right to live in a healthy planet as we do.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
How do we appease their rights?
Absolutely. Yeah. And something, so this is another figure that I haven't been talking about, but I've been referring to, at least in my mind, is an American man named Thomas Berry, he was a Catholic priest and a theologian who had a great interest in Earth history and the human presence on the planet moving forward, and how do we survive the ecological crisis that we're facing now? How do we come out the other side? And he was greatly influenced by Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, who is one of Vernadsky's colleagues. Teilhard was also a priest. He was a Jesuit, and Thomas Berry called this the great work. How do we figure out the great work? Is how do we figure out how to have a mutually beneficial presence on the planet as opposed to a presence of destruction? He had this. He said this many times in different ways, and it's a really good point. You can't have healthy humans on an unhealthy planet. So, like, really, in the future, moving forward, if we want a healthy, well-functioning global society in the future, that's really critical on first establishing and maintaining a healthily functioning biosphere. Humans can only be healthy if the biosphere is healthy, and the biosphere can only be healthy if humans are healthy. And that's something that he really emphasized, and really in the great work that we have to do moving forward is really figuring out how to do that, how to maintain our planetary health, the health of humanity, the health of the biosphere in such a way that the health of humanity is mutually enhancing the health of the biosphere and vice versa. Yeah. So how do we get over these destructive tendencies and relationships that are currently, at the root of our modern ecological environmental crisis?
Global cooperation is the answer that I've got, but that's a challenge. That will be a challenge indeed.
Absolutely.
But the more science we have, the more beers we drink together, and the closer we would be to fulfilling the great work, I think.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Dan, thank you very much for having a chat with me.
Well, thanks for having me. It's a lot of fun, Mike.
Pleasure. Hope to see you back in Denmark in a bar someday real soon.
Yeah, hopefully not.
Thank you very much for sharing your knowledge with us.
Thank you so much for having me, Michael. It's nice chatting with you.
So thanks very much to Dan Mills. If you want to know more about Dan, check out his website, danielbrodymills.com, where you can see links to some of his social social media sites. So that's Daniel Brady Mills, DanielBradymills.com. So yeah, please get in touch. Tell me what you thought about that. What you liked, what you didn't like. Let me know what kind of topics you would like to hear on future episodes. Next week I'll be joined by Thomas Buru, who is a PhD student at Copenhagen Business School, and I'll be talking to him about culture policy in Denmark. When he's not a PhD student, Thomas is also the lead singer of a punk band, Chvila. So I'm very much looking forward to having a beer with Thomas. Thanks for listening. Cheers to science.